Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the Serious Strategy Gamer and we are playing Hearts of Iron 4 with the new Man the Guns expansion. Now if you know my channel a little bit, you know that I love Paradox Interactive, who were kind enough to provide this game to me, and I do love naval games. So this is very much my sweet spot because this is a naval expansion for the base game. Now, we want to try out something particular and something new, I think. So we want to play in a destroyer swarm scenario. So as the naval mechanics of Hearts of Iron 4 have been completely overhauled, we want to try out whether it's viable to play with a torpedo-based army, or navy rather. So the nation that we are going to play that as is, we are of course going to pick a nation that is heavily involved in naval warfare, and we don't want to go for the Empire of Japan. Now Japan is a very interesting country for their playstyle. We're just going to start the game over here because it had a very specific development during the time frame, which is reflected in our national focus tree over here, and that is the Long Lance Torpedo. The torpedo, I think the Type 93 it was, which was basically an oxygen-based torpedo. So instead of the pressurized air that all of the other navies used to keep in their torpedo while it burned the fuel, they used pure oxygen storage tanks, which of course were much more efficient at storing, well, oxygen, whereas, you know, mostly compressed air is nitrogen, which is not reactive. So that in effect gave the Japanese one of the best torpedoes at the time. It was vastly superior to the torpedo of any other nation at the time. In particular, it has to be said, the Germans and the Americans, who at least initially in the war struggled very much to get their torpedoes right. They were running too low, they were running, the triggers didn't quite work out as intended, so the Japanese didn't really have these problems. The Japanese did provide one of the heaviest and strongest torpedoes in the world at the time. So that is what we're going to base our naval game on. So Japan, we are going to play somewhat historical in that we want to approach the wars in the way that Japan did more or less historically. So we are going to go for China, but ultimately we are going to probably end up in war with the United States, because if we go to China, we expect that the United States might have a say about that, and they will come at us, as was the case for the historical naval planning of Japan. We want to use torpedoes, and we want to build a platform in the new naval designer, which we should be able to see over here. So that is the new interface. We're going to talk about that in a second, but what that basically does is, if we take, let's say, one of the early destroyer hulls, and we create a variant, so you have that base naval destroyer, and you can add certain modules to it. You always need, I think, a battery, so a type of gun. Let's pick for a second the lower priority one, and we could, for example, place torpedo launchers on that. We could also use anti-air, naval warfare, anti-submarine warfare. Do we have minesweeping gear? We do. So yeah, so for example, we could build destroyers with a lot of torpedoes, and that would be extremely interesting. You could see that this destroyer would already have a torpedo attack of 81, which is whooping. If we do increase that with the Long Lance Torpedo focus, national focus, we would gain a national spirit, the Long Lance, which grants torpedo screen penetration plus 20%. And what that means is, if we do engage the Americans, 20% of our torpedoes will penetrate, or will go through the screen, their destroyer screen, and might hit their capital ship. So what we are hoping to achieve over here is build a destroyer swarm, let's say, use torpedoes against their main battleship line, defeat their battleship that way, defeat their carriers that way, and then end up with the light cruisers on the other side, or light screens like destroyers, like light cruisers and so on. But basically what we want to do is establish, well, use all of our resources, all of our naval resources in that regard. So we are not going to use we are not going to use heavily carriers. We are primarily going all in on the torpedo attack, and let's see what that does. Maybe it's a very useful strategy, maybe the game mechanics are very much turned against that. We will have to see, but I am interested to find out, so that is what we want to do over here. Now, I've been talking 5 minutes about what we have in mind. Of course, other than that, our strategy will follow a somewhat historical approach. So, historically, Japan was at the time sort of looking at the remnants of the great empires of France, the United Kingdom, with all of its dependencies around the world. And it was still kind of in a colonial sort of late-coming stage where it wanted to gather resources from China to expand its industrial base. So our approach will be to attack China directly and then ultimately go down the southern route, because one of the other new mechanics is fuel. We can stockpile about 400,000 fuel, which doesn't seem to be too much, and we will be using fuel in times of war. Of course, historically, the US and the Dutch East Indies decided on an oil embargo against Japan, and that meant that Japan didn't really... No, I don't want to look for supplies, I do want to look for resources. Resources? Here we go. So historically this was a very oil producing area. You can see that there are a couple of production areas over here, 16, 16, 6, 15 oil, and that is really all of the oil that was discovered in the region at the time. So there isn't really that much more that we could get our hands on, really. Well, somewhere in middle Siberia, I suppose. So yeah, that is something that we do need to look for. We will be embargoed at some point, and at that point we will probably lose our capabilities of waging war very, very quickly if we don't have enough fuel or oil to turn into fuel. So yeah, the southern strategy is going to be a very natural one for us, and that is going to be fine and good. So let's briefly look at the new interface. I'm not completely familiar with it yet, but of course we do have this interface, which is somewhat as expected. I don't think they have changed too much about the focus tree indeed. So yeah, we will probably use the option of purging. Is that correct? Yeah. Of purging the Kadoha faction, which does lead down to the South Strike Doctrine and the Marco Polo Bridge incident, our ability hopefully to secure China, develop the Chinese resources, and ultimately exploit the southern region around Singapore, around the Dutch East Indies. It will also provide various positive benefits around the way. Of course, we are also going to go for the Longlands and ultimately torpedo cruiser naval focus over here, although of course it's not something that we do want to do initially. We don't need our navy on the first day, or probably even in the first year, but ultimately that is something that we do want to do. After that, what I probably want to do is not go for carrier warfare experiments, as would have been the case historically, which would lead to the very powerful Zero airplane, but to use the supremacy of the battlefield. And the reason for that is that we could then use Kura Naval Arsenal as our ship designer, which does grant a better speed, a better armor, but most importantly, screen torpedo attack plus 25%. So that I would hope to actually increase our abilities by quite a lot. We will probably not go to the ultimate super battleship, because again, our focus is going to be on torpedoes. Of course, we'll also have to think a little bit about Manchuria, a little bit about the army. All of that is very important, but I think we will probably even start with the political faction over here. So let's also look at the other parts of the screen. So I think in terms of research, you'll not see too much over here on the infantry side, except for mobile infantry and the technology here for, is it amphibious assaults? I think these should probably be amphibious assaults, or amphibious tractors, yeah. So that's new. That's something that we will have to think about, because, well, we will probably be conducting a lot of amphibious assaults. Not much new over here in the support companies. Armor I don't expect to be seeing too much. Armor is probably not something... Oh, yeah, amphibious armor over here. But it's probably not something that we are going to rely on very heavily. But yeah, artillery, there are some differences in that our ship modules do use anti-air. Normal artillery is, however, not part of that, so we'll have to see about that. Land doctrine, as you would expect. Naval, of course, extremely overhauled, and we are going to look at the naval screen in a second, but you can see that there are depth charges. There's a depth charge thrower, there's basically a hedgehog type depth mortar. So anti-submarine warfare, sonars, improved catapults, better armor, and so on and so forth, including torpedoes with a magnetic detonator that was causing so much trouble for both the Americans and the Germans. Electric torpedoes. To be honest, this would be slightly incompatible with the long lance torpedo, which is a torpedo that burns fuel, so that isn't using an electric charge to be propelled forwards. But that is way ahead in the future. So yeah, like 1940. We are of course starting in 1936. Of course also the homing torpedo over here would be extremely interesting. You can see the different guns that we could be using. Basically the game does distinguish between in terms of naval gunnery. It does distinguish between light batteries, medium batteries and heavy batteries, which are important against well, light ships a little bit better, and heavy ships respectively. And you can improve the guns, you can also improve the ammo. We could also increase our research of secondary batteries, but I don't think that's something that we will do immediately. I think the other big change is not so much over here. In terms of engineering, I think we should see that some of these radar installations should allow us to build, yeah, basic naval search radar. So we'll be able to install naval stuff on our ships. Also, improved fire control systems might, of course, be very important. So that is something that we might need to deal with. And in terms of industry, an important factor will be this part over here. Synthetic oil and oil refueling, so refining. So these are things that of course are very important for Japan, because naturally at home it doesn't really have any oil or any rubber, so that is definitely something that we do need to deal with at some point. Right, I really don't want to see these supplies. Okay, we do have a little bit of an army. Okay, that's just the Navy. Can I get the army, please? Okay, let's see. So our army right now consists of, what, 47 divisions? No, many more than that. Not that many more though. So yeah, we have about 60 divisions, some light tanks, some infantry, a lot of cavalry actually, a lot of like garrison type units that will probably be not that effective. A couple of marines, we'll of course build that up over time. And yeah, all of these ones with the red arrows are probably simply garrison type units here. You can see it's 6 battalions of infantry, which is not really that much. And our normal basic infantry does carry 12 infantry battalions, including some and additionally some engineers and recon companies. It's decent, but of course that will need to be built up. Cavalry is around, but not critical. Motorized brigades or divisions are around. Some tanks, yeah, but you can see they are very, very light, and I doubt that we will have the resources to develop that too much. We do have a couple of air wings. I think in our long-term naval strategy, we are of course going to focus that on the light ships, on the screen ships that are going to put torpedoes hopefully on the enemy, and they will hopefully disable the enemy battleships and carriers. And at that point we will need to deal with the enemy screens and for the enemy screens I think what we're going to build up is another type of cruiser, probably, hopefully, that will be able to take them out. I'm mostly worried about American air power, because they will probably go for air wings and carrier battleships, or carriers and battleships. But mostly I'm worried about the carrier. I hope that our torpedo-based navy will be able to stand up against the battleships, but against so in a straight-out shooting competition, but we'll have to see about the enemy air power. So for the air power, I think our own carriers will probably be changed up a little bit and use a slightly different air wing composition to what we have right now. Can I actually see that? Okay, you are the carrier. Somehow I should be able to see that. Over here? Yeah. So yeah, right now you have a couple of fighters, a couple of close air supports. We'll probably change that up to include many more fighters. We can actually do that now. So let's get a standard layout of 40 fighters. And, oh, you know what? As long as we are fighting in, potentially in China, we should probably go for more rather than fewer close air wings. So they will be supporting our ground attack, and that might be helpful. Good, but in the long term, I think we'll mostly look to support our naval warfare with proper fighters, so that our torpedo swarm tactics will work out. Short historical excursion. Of course, that idea isn't completely new, and it wasn't historically very alien to the Japanese in the time. So the concept really relies on some French concept, and I'm gonna butcher that name, John École or something, the young school it means, of the French in the 1860s, I want to say, so basically mid to late 19th century, when at the time France naval theorists thought about or observed, let's say, the emergence of the torpedo, of the Whitehead torpedo in particular, and thought that maybe that would allow a very small aircraft, very small naval craft, to defeat very large battleships, and that you could build many small torpedo boats at the cost of one single battleship and make it prohibitive to engage the navy. And thereby achieve a good superiority. That is something that we want to follow up here. The Japanese did historically attack Port Arthur when it was in Russian hands, and conduct a very successful naval strike with their torpedo boats against Russian destroyers, and were able to defeat them very soundly. But all in all, the torpedo didn't quite catch up in the period. It did, however, sorry about that. It might have catched up at the point where Japan was developing this new long-lance torpedo. Historically, of course, it didn't. Japan tried to build a couple of torpedo cruisers, but they were never really used in the capacity that they were officially designed for. So yeah, they never really tried it out, and we want to try it out over here. Somewhat later, historically, in the 1960s, the concept was somewhat revived with the concept of guided missile boats. So boats loaded up with guided missiles, and they quickly meant the end of the battleship, really, if it hadn't been kicked in by the carrier already. So I've been talking for 18 minutes now. We are going to set up the game very shortly, and I think after that I'll be rearranging a little bit, and then we can start out our proper Let's Play. So let's start out by selecting a national focus. Now, again, I don't think the new naval estimates or the army expansion law are critical, although the army experience would be nice to conduct some refurbishments, but also the modern naval arms wouldn't be, infantry arms wouldn't be too bad. No, but on the other hand, we do have good technology over there. So yeah, what we are indeed going to do is then purge the Coda hull faction. That's going to increase our base stability, which is very nice. Our stability is already quite high, I have to say, so we might want to do a decision before that. But all in all, I think that's going to be alright. And then we are probably going to trying to establish a little bit our industrial base and other political effects. So yeah, let's go ahead and let's start out by purging the Kodar faction. I think that's fine. Let's also go for research, and we're gonna of course go firstly into industry and start with production technology, because that is always a very, very good technology to research. Construction I think would also be very much a good technology, but engineering of course with the research speed, just 88 days, that's a very, very good technology. And it does also provide us with central range finding, which increases light and heavy attack of any ship, but would increase production costs. We're not going to use that for now, but we are going to use the research boost. And you can see that in 1936 there are a lot of electronic technologies that you can research, including mechanical computing. And that just simply adds up over time. In industry, I do think construction does make a lot of sense in the mid to short term. 1937 technology really is out of the question for now. Air doctrine, air technology, better fighters might be useful. But let's start out with infantry warfare, because infantry warfare is very, very useful initially. So type 3 heavy machine guns, support weapons basically, which would give us a certain small improvement in our basic components, wouldn't be too shabby. On the other hand, artillery, I think the support artillery can be extremely useful because it doesn't require any upgrade in terms of in terms of our equipment. It's immediately available, and it does improve our artillery capabilities by quite a bit. So I do think that's a very interesting choice. Other than that, really the most interesting bit I think are the fighters. Some of the destroyer and search technologies would be nice, but they're not critical. Tanks I don't think we do need right now. I mean, it would be nice to get an upgrade, but I'm slightly worried about our fuel consumption, so that is something that we should keep in mind. And you know what, we are going to go for the infantry, no, for the artillery. There we go. Okay, so that is set up. We should take a brief look at our national spirits. Division recovery rate is pretty good. Daily political power gain is somewhat reduced. Duplicate research efforts between the Navy and the Army meant that Japan really had a lot of different aircrafts, which was not that great. Militarism is pretty good except for the research speed, of course. And inter-service rivalry is somewhat balanced right now. Ooh, this is an important one. We are currently limited to cruisers with a maximum cost of 5,300. That is something that we could cheat on, or we could abandon the naval treaty, but for now that's fine. We don't really have to produce that much. Let's keep an eye on the free civilian factories. I think one of the first things that we do want to build is, since our stockpiles right now of fuel are full, I do think it makes sense to build up a fuel silo, and that will be one of the first things that we will be building. I do think over here might make a lot of sense. We do have 14 civilian factories, so that's fine. It shouldn't take too long, yeah, until February. How much exactly does that give us? Fuel capacity would increase by 100,000 only. That's not a lot. So in fact we might already decide that we will be needing more than just one. I think 5 will be fine. We might switch that out after... Ah yeah, you know what? We should only build one for now and then see how much more we can stockpile, and maybe squeeze in a couple of civilian factories or something like that in. In terms of military factories, we are producing infantry equipment, that's alright. Support equipment, that's also of course always very good. Towed artillery is nice. I don't want to produce too many interwar fighters or indeed too many naval bombers. I think indeed that we can drop the production of naval fighters, of naval bombers. I think a couple of more infantry equipment And artillery pieces are in order. How many more factories have I got? Oh, 7. Okay, yeah, that's fine. More for everything then, really. Except for fighters. I don't think we need that many fighters. Some motorized equipment wouldn't be terrible. Although, of course, it does require fuel, and we are not particularly keen on producing or requiring more fuel. So, okay, let's make sure that we are producing quite a bit of infantry equipment, and I do want to increase our artillery so that we can break through the Chinese lines a little bit quicker. That's alright. We do have decisions available. I don't think that we should have too many decisions available because we practically have no political power. Well, we could train up our puppets armies, but that is not something that I intend to do right now. We are a little bit short on resources, but honestly it's not too much. It's a little bit of steel that we are missing, so that means that our production here of interwar fighters does decrease a little bit. You can see it's decreasing by 5% because we don't have the rubber, and potentially it's going to decrease for some of these ships because we don't have the steel. Probably a little bit more than that. Just 5%. You know what? That is something that I can very much live with. Last thing I do want to do over here is set up these guys to be only of a protection length of one ship each, because I really don't plan on building too many of these ships. And we are gonna simply set up all of our spare capacity to flow into these things. You can also see that it's a lot more difficult to build up or to build a converted cruiser hull than to build up a new destroyer, because you can commit to more dockyards into building these. So that, I think, is going to be alright. Good. Unassigned divisions, yes, that is something that I will deal with in between episodes, because I think it's a little bit tedious just to set that up in the beginning, and it's not really that critical. Right! You know, guys, I've been doing a lot of talking and there's very little action this turn, but I do promise that it's going to be an interesting experiment over here where we will find out whether torpedoes are worthless in Hearts of Iron 4. Thank you very much for watching. Do like, subscribe. I would very much appreciate if you let me know whether you find it interesting, our little experiment over here, and whether you think we'll be absolutely screwed, or indeed whether we have a shot against the US Navy. Thank you for watching, guys. See you soon.